August 2nd, 1941, the press release in the Washington Evening Star stated, "The chief executive will be leaving Washington by train tomorrow morning and will arrive in New London, Connecticut tomorrow night. Now at New London, he will board the White House yacht Potomac for a week of cruising along the New England coast." Further down in the article, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox asked the press to please regard Mr. Roosevelt's cruise as a secret matter and to treat the cruise as a movement of other naval ships are treated. He asked that papers not indulge in journalistic enterprises and try to follow the president on another boat. Knox stated, "The president has been carrying a very heavy load, and let's let him get a week or 10 days of complete rest." It was just a fishing expedition, but with world-changing ramifications. Rest was the last thing on Roosevelt's agenda. The news hounds had figured out something was up, and the speculation had already begun even before Roosevelt left the White House. Headlines speculated Roosevelt and Churchill were going to meet. Churchill was flying over from Britain. Roosevelt was planning to declare war on Germany. Rumors and speculations ran wild. Now, the official White House log for August 3rd stated, 4:10 a.m. to Union Station, en route to New London, Connecticut for New England cruise on the USS Potomac with Dr. Ross T. McIntyre, General Edwin M. Watson, and Captain John Berdahl. 8:30 p.m. Leave New London for cruise on the Potomac. Now, Roosevelt spent the day of August 4th fishing off Cape Cod to establish his location beyond a reasonable doubt. So began one of the biggest subterfuges in presidential politics. Or was it? The news hounds were right. Roosevelt was on his way to meet Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They just could not prove it. Later that night, the USS Potomac and the United States Coast Guard cutter Calypso changed their course and traveled 3 hours to the western end of Martha's Vineyard Island. Now, it was here that President Roosevelt and his party were transferred to the USS Augusta. On board the Augusta were Roosevelt's chief naval and military advisors. They had departed from New York Harbor earlier on a destroyer and were waiting for Roosevelt on board the Augusta. So, on the morning of August 5th, 1941, Roosevelt and his party were secretly transferred to the heavy cruiser USS Augusta. Now, the Augusta and the USS Tuscaloosa, another cruiser, with the destroyers USS McDougal, Moffett, Sampson, and Winslow providing escort, departed with the President and his party for Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. Now, over in Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, along with his service chiefs, boarded the battlecruiser Prince of Wales on August 4th, and they proceeded west towards their rendezvous with Roosevelt. Now, the cover story of a fishing cruise was not holding water. The following coded message was sent to Roosevelt on the Augusta from his press secretary, Steve Early, on August 5th. For Captain John R. Berdahl. Newspapers today feature headline, quote, Churchill and Hopkins conferring at sea. Churchill flying to the United States. Consequently, much excitement prevails. London press reports statements published by the Daily Mail that a very important personage is preparing to fly to the United States to see President. This report, coupled with statements made today in the House of Commons that Churchill will not find it convenient to attend forthcoming House of Commons debate on the progress of the war, apparently is origin of the press stories and headlines. This for your information. Signed Early. Now, the August 5th headlines in the Waterbury Democrat said, Churchill, Hopkins may have joined Roosevelt. Roosevelt transferred to fast cruiser to meet them. So much for the top secret movement Secretary Knox was hoping for. Now, the cat was out of the bag. This secret meeting was not really that secret. Roosevelt's and Churchill's teams were scrambling to keep a lid on the upcoming meeting. U.S. Ambassador to Britain, John Gilbert Winnett, cabled the State Department the following message. This afternoon, Mr. Eden sent for me to say that there has been some leakage or some clever guesswork concerning the Prime Minister's present moves. He continues with, the German radio at 8:15 last night gave the intimation, quoting a report from Lisbon. Newspapermen here today have been putting several factors together and arrived at the same conclusion. Now, the Prime Minister, before he left, prepared a statement to be made publicly only in the event of a leak. The fishing trip story was unraveling fast. Roosevelt was being bombarded with cables from the State Department on whether or not to release details of the impending meeting with Churchill. Now, for Churchill's part, he realized the cover story might not hold water, so he sent a draft to Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, through Anthony Eden, suggesting that he wanted to release in the event that the cover story was blown. The context of the message said, the Prime Minister accepted an invitation to meet President Roosevelt for a discussion of the general course of the war, the method of U.S. aid to Britain, and matters of common interest. The Prime Minister is accompanied by the First Sea Lord and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the Permanent Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs. The meeting is taking place on board ship somewhere in the Atlantic. No further statement can be made at this stage as to matters discussed at the meeting or the date of the Prime Minister's return to this country. To issue the above statement, the President might want to have statements made to the people of the United States. Eden said that a reply as to our concurrence or other views would be most useful. If there was no reply from Roosevelt, he would tell the House that he had nothing to say at this time about Churchill's whereabouts. Well, Roosevelt did not send any message. Now, the reason being, he was still governing a divided country. Even though more and more people realized war was inevitable, Roosevelt still had to deal with a large majority of citizens who were against the war and any kind of help for Britain. Roosevelt did not want anything released that would give the anti-war movement ammunition until the conference was over. This way he could present the country with a fait accompli, as they say. Now, one of Roosevelt's biggest headaches was the America First Committee. Its leaders were the powerful Republican senator from North Dakota, Gerald Nye, and the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh, the American who flew across the Atlantic. They vehemently opposed America's entry into a second European war. Now, if that were not enough of a headache, it was during this period that Congress was debating the extension of the peacetime draft. All draftees were scheduled for discharge in October. That was just 2 months away. Roosevelt was dealing with an isolationist Congress that did not want to maintain a standing army. Roosevelt had to push for legislation which would extend the draft for another 18 months. Now, the soldiers drafted in 1940 were not happy. They were only supposed to be in the Army for 1 year. That year was up in October. That was just 2 months away. The draftees started to write in large capital letters, Ohio, all over the Army bases. This was worrying the higher-ups in the Army. You see, Ohio stood for over the hill in October. America's peacetime draft army was threatening to desert en masse come October 1941. Another major problem Roosevelt had to deal with during his fishing vacation was the Navy taking control of Federal Ship. Now, Federal Ship was a Navy contractor for shipbuilding. The workers had gone on strike, crippling shipbuilding activities for the Navy. The strike threatened to stall America's rearmament program. Any action he took on these two problems normally would require a president to speak directly to the public and explain his reasoning for taking those actions. In this case, Roosevelt's hands were tied. He could not admit to meeting Churchill to discuss war aims until after a deal had been agreed upon. Now, at 09:12 on August 9th, the Prince of Wales and her escorts dropped anchor in Placentia Bay. An interesting side note here, Roosevelt had the American government purchase 1,500 gift boxes. Each box contained a half-pound of cheese, apples, oranges, a carton of cigarettes, and a card reading, "The President of the US of A sends his compliments and best wishes." Now, that night, Roosevelt entertained the British delegation with dinner on board the USS Augusta. The dinner menu was an opulent affair. For hors d'oeuvres, the cooks on the Augusta served almonds, vegetable puree, celeries, olives, and crackers. Now, the main course consisted of broiled spring chicken, buttered sweet peas, spinach omelet, candied sweet potatoes, mushroom gravy, hot rolls with currant jelly. The next course, which some might say was served backwards, was the salad course. It wasn't until after World War II that Americans and Canadians started to serve the salad course first. Anyways, this course consisted of sliced tomato salad with assorted cheeses and crackers. For dessert, the guests were served chocolate ice cream, cookies, cupcakes, coffee, tea, cream, candy, mints, and ginger. And finally, the obligatory cigarettes and cigars. This was all at government expense, by the way. Since the Augusta was a U.S. Navy ship, alcohol was not permitted per Navy regulations. No exceptions were made, at least officially. Present at the dinner was a veritable who's who of civilian and military leaders at that time. On the U.S. side, there was President Franklin Roosevelt, Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold R. Stark, USN, Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, United States Army, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet Ernest J. King, Chief of the Air Corps Major General Henry H. Arnold, the Honorable Harry L. Hopkins, Senior Advisor to the President, and the Honorable Averell Harriman, Senior Advisor to the President. On the British side, there was the Right Honorable Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Honorable Sir Alexander G. M. Cadogan, Permanent Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, Admiral of the Fleet Alfred D.P.R. Pound, GCB, GCVO, Chief of Naval Staff, General Sir John G. Dill, KCB, CMO, DBO, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid R. Freeman, KCSDSO MC, Vice Chief of Air Staff, and Lord Cherwell, Churchill's scientific advisor. That was a mouthful. Now, as was the custom, all of the dinner guests signed the menu. The next day was Sunday, August 10th. This was when the famous picture of Roosevelt and Churchill was taken during what they called church parade. In the United States, we would just say going to church. Once church parade was over, Churchill also reciprocated FDR's hospitality by hosting a lunch party for the Americans on the Prince of Wales. Now, unfortunately, there are no surviving menus from that luncheon. The Prince of Wales was sunk December 10, 1941 by the Japanese. The formal discussion between the two heads of state and their respective advisors began on August 11th. Churchill wanted America to declare war on Nazi Germany, but he knew that was a non-starter. He could ask, but he knew Roosevelt would refuse. His main concern was Lend-Lease and America moving its naval defensive zone further east in the Atlantic. So the advisors hammered out plans for Lend-Lease aid to Britain and Russia and moving the American zone of defense eastward, and the threat of Japan against British colonies. Churchill wanted the U.S. to declare war on Japan if the Japanese attacked British colony possessions in the Far East. Now, Roosevelt refused this request. However, he did agree to warn Japan in the strongest diplomatic terms that continued aggression in the Pacific area would not be tolerated. It was during the conference Roosevelt received news that the Senate passed the Draft Extension Act. Now, this was a close one. At first, it was believed that the Democrats would only muster about 20 votes. If the draft extension was not passed, America's army would not have a cadre of trained men to lead when war was declared. This would have been a repeat of World War I, when the country had to create an army from scratch. This was something Roosevelt was determined to avoid. Steve Early, the president's press secretary, cabled Roosevelt the following message on August 12th. After 10-hour session, House tonight passed Senate bill with slight modification providing for an 18 months extension by a vote of 203 to 202. Had to go outside for help. Signed, Early. The outside help Early was talking about were Republican senators. Roosevelt was a happy man. He had preserved the Army. The draft had been extended by just one vote. Roosevelt would not have to go through what Wilson went through in April of 1917. With all of Roosevelt's subterfuge about the fishing trip, the newspapers had a fairly good idea something important was going on. The speculation of a meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill continued to grow. It was all anybody was talking about in the press rooms throughout the country. Where is Roosevelt? Where is Churchill? The reporters were not stupid. Roosevelt and Churchill's top advisors went missing after August 3rd. Churchill had not been seen at the House of Commons for the question and answer debate during this period. The press realized something was up. They just didn't know how world-changing it would be. Now, the most important document to come out of this conference was an agreement on the post-war aims of the United States and Great Britain. Now, this is interesting. Even before the U.S. got involved in the war, the U.S. and Britain were planning for a new world order based upon peace, not war. A new world order where a global economy and social welfare were of primary importance. Hey, how you doing? What you want? It's not time to eat. All right, I'll put you out. Hang on, I gotta put the dog out. It would be a new world order where global economy and social welfare were of primary importance. It was a new world order where all people had the right to self-determination and territorial adjustments were decided by the will of the people, not the politicians at the peace conference, such as took place after World War I. Governments would work for a world free of want, fear, and freedom of the seas. Trade barriers would be lowered. Most importantly, neither the United States or the United Kingdom sought any territorial gains. But a curious thing, Churchill was a man of the Victorian era and colonialism. He believed in the empire, which was everything Roosevelt wanted to tear down. So why did Churchill agree to the Atlantic Charter? Well, you've got the Soviet Union that they were still reeling from the German invasion 2 months earlier. Many people believed the Soviets' collapse would happen soon. Churchill believed Hitler was the major threat to the civilized world, not Stalin. His famous quote about Stalin says it all. If Hitler had invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil. At this time, very few people really knew just how bad Joseph Stalin was and his plan for a world dominated by communism. The simple fact is, Churchill needed the U.S. to enter the war. Without the help of the U.S., the best Britain could hope for was a negotiated peace with a continent dominated by Hitler. Realizing the charter called for the disbanding of the British, French, and Dutch empires, along with the lowering of all trade barriers that were imposed by the mother countries on their colonial empires, Churchill had no choice. It was the price Churchill was willing to pay to save Western civilization. Press Secretary Early cabled Roosevelt the following message after the text of the charter was released to select members of Congress. Too soon yet for general reaction. Congressional circles follow expected lines. One immediate reaction worth reporting is feeling on part of some that we have lost 2 of our 4 freedoms, since no mention was made in the 8 points of freedom of religion or freedom of speech and press. Train arrangements, as requested, okay, signed Early. Roosevelt became incensed when it was mentioned by a commentator that 2 of the 4 freedoms were lost. He shot off a cable to Press Secretary Early saying, I heard the commenter who said freedom of press and religion given up. He is either senile or an ass. The same happy thoughts apply to press queries as to whether principles of civilization apply today or next week or a year hence. Tell the boys, Roosevelt always called the press corps the boys. I said so, off the record, FDR. The August 14th headlines for the Evening Star proclaimed, Roosevelt-Churchill list aims, sea meeting, pledges U.S. to help defeat Nazis and rebuild Europe. These 2 men began the building of the New World Order at an inlet in Newfoundland. The meeting lasted just 4 days. It was a meeting that changed the direction of the world. No longer would militarism, fascism, totalitarianism be tolerated. The people of the world were promised freedom from fear and want. The people of the world were promised that aggressor nations would be disarmed and a permanent system of general security would be put into place to guarantee world peace. Today we call this institution the United Nations, the successor to the failed League of Nations created after World War I. Has it lived up to Roosevelt's ideals? Well, yes and no. There has not been another world war since 1945. However, there have been numerous proxy wars and genocides since 1945. The major ones being Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Russia, and America, the genocides in Rwanda, Cambodia, and the former Yugoslavia, just to name a few. So, was it a fishing trip which changed the world we live in today? I'd be very interested in what you have to say. Well, I hope you found this little slice of history interesting. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. Most importantly though, leave a comment below. This way, the algorithm will suggest my video to more viewers. Thank you for watching.